I address you this evening, South Africans, with a heavy heart. Over the past few days and nights, there have been acts of public violence of a kind rarely seen in the history of our democracy. Property has been vandalized and destroyed.
I left my kids for this nonsense. Look. Hey, get it. I've been waiting the whole night for this nonsense.
So what happened was quite a mystery for all of us. It started on Thursday, where we started seeing the trucks being looted and burned in Moy River, and it continued until Sunday. And by Sunday, I mean the KZN as a province was experiencing widespread riots, but it didn't stop there, and it continued until the following week, Friday. As a company, we thought this was just an ordinary riot, and this was something that's not different to what we've experienced in the past years. We realized that we're now talking in excess of 20 billion in terms of claims numbers to Sasria. And our balance sheet, at that time, we realized we could not pay all those claims. So that was the first part. The second part, we realized that we're no longer talking about the average claims that we receive every year of 3,000 a year. We're now looking at almost more than 6,000 claims just for July riots. And our resources internally, in terms of staff and in terms of system, we're not going to be able to deal with those claims. And the third one, we realized that for years, we've been an organization that operates under the radar. So no one really knew about Sasria. So all of a sudden that week, we were in the news, and it was something that was new for all of us as Sasria's leadership on how to manage this crisis, both in terms of media, also in terms of people, and also in terms of our staff.
The July incident was quite devastating to Sasria and also to the country as well. But if I was to bring it just to Sasria, we faced many, many challenges, which I must say our staff, our board of directors, and more importantly, our shareholder came in and made sure that Sasria can perform the role it was designed to do, which is to help South Africans when we are faced with unrest of this magnitude.
The retail sector was severely impacted by the riots that happened last year in South Africa. Thousands of stores around the country were looted, burned, damaged, and many, many more were closed because of the threats that were happening to them. But on top of that, huge portions of the infrastructure were damaged, with many, many distribution centers and modes of transport into those areas disrupted. We faced a really serious case in South Africa that we were going to run out of food in parts of the country. And if we hadn't found solutions pretty quickly, the disaster that we had with the riots, I think, would have been severely exacerbated.
The unrest of July 2021, lots of people around Edendale, they had the frustration because of a lockdown. Abantu babephelelwe umsebenzi, abantu babexoshiwe emsebenzini, abantu bengenawo amathuba emsebenzi. Uma iqala i-lockdown, ithiwe abantu baba confused because babona ithuba elihle lokuthi bakwazi ukuthi badabe. Hey, come on! If I'm gonna hurt you, then I'll hurt you. Come out! Hey, that way. How many people in the backyard?
During the riots, we were in a situation that we had these crowds of people marching from one store to the next. And I think you had three groups of people. You had the people who were in it for political reasons. You had people who were in it for criminal reasons, and I think that was the biggest amount of them. And thirdly, you had people who were rioting because of poverty, and the fourth one was the opportunists. And they were coming to the stores, and because it's a soft target, they were looting and taking what they could out of the stores, and we've seen lots of pictures of that.
Ngingathini mfethu kusamnandi kwesikhashana kodwa sesazohlupheka la eMzansi bafethu kodwa akayikho into esizoyenza nathi sibone bethatha nathi siyathatha ngoba uma ungathathi uzolamba mfethu so ayikho into engenziwa bafethu
mari crime nduna ya
yeah ngiyona
awufuna ubantu uyoyika ubantu awuyika ubantu all right.
You know, I remember watching the scenes on ENCA. I was in disbelief, seeing the sheer scale of, the riots and the looting across, KZN, and it just sends shivers down my spine to see, that level of destruction. And, we kept on getting calls from our center manager and facilities manager, telling us, look, it's looking dire, we're not getting any support. And look, the shopping center at Bridge City was completely destroyed on the inside. However, we still were left with the exterior walls and the roofing.
It took literally only 7 days to cause a destruction that is close to about 60 billion rands, South African rands. And if you compare that with the Chile and the US, it took about a couple of months to get to the same proportions. So in terms of impact, 7 days of destruction, causing close to 60 billion rands worth of damage in 7 days. I think the gravity of that needs to be really understood, what it meant.
They're trying desperately to try and put it out. You can see them with their water pipes there, trying to do as much as they can. Obviously very overwhelmed by this fire, and this is only one but 4 fires that we've spotted from the air right now.
We've always been asked this question as to whether there were any signals that there were going to be a major event. And also, we've also been asked the question whether, as Sasria, whether we're prepared to deal with this thing. So let me start with the first one. I think this is a country that is in deep trouble in terms of economic unemployment. It's extremely high, especially among the youth. Poverty it's terrible, and also in the last 3 years we've seen an increase in labor strikes, we've seen increase in service delivery, and we've seen protests in general. So in our own scenario planning, we were aware and we're anticipating that there might be a similar event that happened in July 23. But what we didn't anticipate is the magnitude. So we always in our scenario planning look at it that there might be an increase in riots, and our planning was how do we make sure as a company that we've got adequate balance sheet to deal with those claims, adequate infrastructure, and also adequate resources to deal with them. So we did anticipate, but the magnitude is something that we all not aware.
At the moment, what we are watching is a shop. We are watching people who are walking out with things like fridges, beds. Pretend they're walking out with furniture now. So the police are trying the best that they can to arrest the people from what they are doing, but it's very difficult.
There will be 3 kinds of intelligences. That will be your defense, your crime intelligence falling under police, and the state security, that is as state security for both national issues and international issues. There is no intelligence that was received by me from those structures in the Republic.
We had a situation where all the police were right around, but they were standing around doing nothing because we had such huge crowds that the few policemen who were there couldn't react because I think their personal safety was at risk. We had the same with the security guards. So we, as the Consumer Goods Council, our security cluster within us, we were getting the information. That information was then being fed back to government. Government was then responding by sending the troops or sending police in. And other industries were doing the same. But it was the private sector who had the intelligence on the ground, which was feeding back into the government, and the government was then trying to respond accordingly. And that's because the whole crime intelligence system seemed to have broken down over that particular period. And then we tried to actually stop the crowds coming through. And fortunately, the taxi industry almost came to the rescue of the retail industry by coming in and blockading a lot of the shopping centers and just stopping the looters and the rioters actually getting near the shops. But they were doing it obviously for their own vested interest as well, which is people use taxis backwards and forwards to shopping centers. No shopping centers, no customers. So it became a very, very important thing where effectively the private sector stopped the riots that were happening in South Africa.
I'm Dr. Kevin Naidu. I'm from Reservoir Hills, Durban. We have been manning this area for the last 3 days and 3 nights in order to protect our residents from any further looting, any further violence against them, and any damages to property and life.
So we don't believe that the state security cluster reacted in the manner that it should have. We don't believe that SAPS reacted in the manner that it should have. Bearing in mind that the violence and the looting started on the Friday and escalated quite rapidly over the weekend. The South African Defence Force only got called in 5 days later into the looting. And largely as a result of the South African police force just having the inability to quell that type of violence. So we don't believe that there was a well-coordinated response. I think everybody was caught off guard.
When I look back, I look at heroes in this whole, looting, incident or the riots, and I would obviously like to mention one of our staff members, Siyabonga Konke. He put his life at risk, when the police, the army, couldn't get onto site quick enough. He was there with the security team, extinguishing fires. The looters were setting all the stores alight with fires, and, they were there with the fire extinguishers trying to limit the damage, as far as they could. And even the fire brigade let them down because they were too scared to enter the property unless the army was there to protect them. So, Siyabonga Konke, he put his life at risk, and we're forever grateful for that, because the amount of damage he limited to the center allowed us to probably re-establish the center quicker, when we redevelop it.
The South African police, of course, when things are getting out of hand, the police would need to come and disperse the crowds and ensure that there's protection of those properties. And when that really starts to get out of hand, that's when the army comes in. So those level of defense, even in the way that we manage the risk, we margin, we calculate, we scenario plan, and we even price. We include those elements because those elements are important. So there was no expectation, if I'm now making reference to that report of the panel of experts, because it makes reference to certain levels within these two that broke down. So in other words, the response was delayed. If the response could have been on time, maybe, we could be talking a different story. But the bottom line is that I think those are the parts where I think communication in particular, as and when the event was taking place, should have been better. Because if it was, then obviously, the situation would have been handled. I think that's one of those things that we take forward as well. So in terms of communication between the state, between the clusters of security, between the SAPS, between the communities and the insured themselves, and Sasria as an entity that is taking the risk, there needs to be an integrated approach or integrated manner of having to communicating with one another, so that there is a way of migrating from one level of defense to the next, until such time that the risk is actually protected.
siphatheke kabuhlungu kakhulu, especially imisebenzi yethu. Manje siyohlala emakhaya, asazi ukuthi siyophinde sisebenze noma ngesiphinde sisebenze, asazi noma izovulwa amashophu, siyohlala emakhaya, asinakudla, asinalutho. Ibhlungu inhliziyo zethu. Asazi nama rent ukuthi siwabhadala ngani ngoba siyarenta. Inhliziyo zethu zibhlungu kakhulu.
The communities, I think, were the most affected, and how they were affected directly. One is that most of the businesses that were torched, that were destroyed, they are in the same communities where the people that live in those communities are employed. So the first part, which was the biggest, was that loss of employment. We went to visit Bridge City, and we actually found out that about 3,000 employees had no employment for the past year, as we sit today. So the first part was loss of employment, meaning loss of income for certain communities. And we found out that some of them were actually the breadwinners that were working in those particular retailers, for instance, because those were probably the ones that were affected the most. So a mall that burns down, it means pretty much everybody who works there would have lost employment.
We need to understand, and in some of these rural areas, the shopping center is the only asset in that specific area where people get accessibility to bread, milk, sasa grounds, and everything else. And it's also a large employer within a township or rural area. It could well employ over 1,000 people. So I think when the unrest sparked off and the shops were looted and the shopping centers were burned down to the ground, a lot of those people have remained unemployed.
Amanda! We are saying no to our infrastructures, no! No to our infrastructures, no! We are not going to destroy our own life here. This is black excellence, let's protect it! Let's champion the interest of the black people here! We are protecting Konka, we are protecting PDL, we are protecting Maponya Mall, all the entities there, they are protector. We are protecting our own. Let's look when you get seven dagate.
A mall, for instance, it benefits the communities that are in that particular area. The communities, you'd expect them as well, to a certain degree, to protect those properties that they depend on for supplies, for an example. And that is why you saw what happened in Soweto, for instance, in Maponya Mall, where the community stood up and said, this mall you are not going to burn down because our sisters and mothers, they work in those communities, in that particular mall, and this is our mall. They took ownership of the mall and said, in as much as it is owned by a particular individual, it is our mall. They took ownership of it and they protected it, and that worked pretty well.
The impact of July unrest on the country's reputation was really bad. And I say this because we've, during that period, and if you look at the short-term dent, there's two things one looks at. We looked at the media perceptions at the time, which emanated from the coverage that was obviously global. And what we saw was an impact from a short-term perspective in how the world saw South Africa. So our pillars such as governance, they were compromised. Our pillars of Ubuntu, for instance, they were compromised. When the world looks at South Africa, they look at South Africa through the eyes of our forefathers, and in this instance, Mandela. It undoubtedly, he remains one of the core identities when South Africa is brought about in the global community, even amongst ourselves as South Africans. So the July unrest really almost challenged us in terms of what we stand for as the people of South Africa. You know, when we protest, are we doing it responsibly or are we not? And unfortunate, it is unfortunate that during that time, I think a lot of socio-economic challenges that are facing our people manifested in what transpired in July. So on the short term, from a media perspective, definitely the brand did bleed.
The investor confidence as a result of the unrest has been very, very negative, both local and international. In some cases, I'm hearing that KZN is a no-go area, both again with local and international investors. So it's been very, very negative. And there are still concerns. I think KZN particularly is a red flag to international investors. We have also noticed this over the last 12 months where some investors whose assets were looted and burnt have decided not to go back. In other instances, you don't have a choice but to rebuild. So it has, on the whole, been fairly negative.
For those visuals we saw that unfolded here in South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal and in Gauteng, of that high levels of violence, the flames that we were seeing on our own television screens, those flames were multiplied probably 50 times around the world in major media networks. And that means that's the image that the world remembers about South Africa in that particular era, in July 2021. But all is not lost. The opportunity is that while there are significant damages that were done to the image of the country, while some investors have actually exited South Africa as a market, and while some travelers around the world may perceive us as an extremely violent and highly volatile environment where violence can erupt at any given point in time. There are investors who stayed here in South Africa, but importantly, the opportunities is for us to strengthen the value proposition. And how we strengthen that value proposition of South Africa is to address the things that have happened, the things that have gone wrong, and to be seen as a country to be dealing with issues of crime, high levels of crime that we see every day. We need to be seen by international media, international partners, as demonstrating that we are addressing the challenges that we're facing as a society and as a country, and there has to be consequences where things go wrong deliberately.
So the customer journey is different. Sasria is removed from the client because there's a number of people within the value chain that participate before a policy is underwritten. A client would first talk to the broker then will talk to an agent company who is an insurer, and then that insurer will then take the policy up to Sasria. So at the time of a claim, a client will then follow that value chain as it is. There's a broker, the broker goes to the agent company gets to Sasria. And that's ordinarily how a value chain will go.
The claims process, it's been really great with Sasria. The communication has been good. We understand, again, the sheer volume of claims that Sasria received, it's just, I feel sorry for, the department that is processing those claims, because you can imagine there's just hundreds and thousands of claims coming through, from small businesses to large businesses, and everybody wants to be paid out at the same time. And, if you think about it, no insurance organization, I think, was equipped for such an unprecedented event. But I think, they are making concerted effort to get all the claims paid out. We've, again, had a positive experience in that just over 50% of all of our claims have been paid out, which has allowed us actually to start that redevelopment of Bridge City and allow us to be on track for our opening date, which will be in May 2023 officially. Even some of those insurance proceeds have helped us to reopen Super Spa. That will provide, we identified we needed a grocer up and running as quick as possible. And we used some of those insurance premiums to develop that part of the shopping center so that we could get essential goods and services to the community, so that the community doesn't need to travel large distances, which would then obviously eat into the disposable income on their spend for essential groceries.
Whenever I've had an opportunity to engage with them and meet with them, I am actually quite excited to be working with this bunch of dedicated people. Often, I send emails at 10 p.m. at night, 11 p.m. at night, and 9 out of 10 times those emails get responded to the point now I've told people, please, you don't have to respond. You can respond in the morning. It's so that I work best at night. So the mood is quite positive. They appreciate the role that they've played during this difficult time in South Africa. And mine now is to reset the company and say to them, all right, how do we prepare for the next one? So I'm trying to bring in an element of military training that says you must always be ready for something that you might not ever have to do. So for example, we'll get half of our staff. Whether you are in accounting, whether you are in marketing, in all the other areas, when we are faced with a crisis of a disaster and claims, they should be able to deal with claims. So half the company will be able to deal with claims in the future. So that's how we are making it excellent. And also, we are broadening what we're going to be doing as Sasria. Yes, primarily, there are certain perils we insure. We're going to grow into other areas, which I think provides our people with exciting opportunities to use their intellectual capability and contribute even more to the South African cause.
If we hadn't had Sasria, I think the country would be in a far worse state than we are at the moment. For 30, 40, I'm not sure how many years Sasria has been around, but we've always been paying our premiums into it. And I don't think we've ever had a real claim against Sasria ever. But this time when we needed it, it was there and we got it. And it's a critical part of infrastructure within society and within the country. I think the sadness is that we needed the cover. And the sadness is that they had to pay us out. But I think from our perspective, and the one bit of advice I would give to companies coming out of the riots is make sure you've got your entire claim systems, insurance systems set up. Because one of the reasons we got paid out so quickly is that we were able to get our claim in very quickly. And we did that because over the years with our insurance brokers and our team, we had prepared properly to make sure that if there was a disastrous event, we were A, properly covered, and B, prepared and able to claim quickly.
Our confidence is still in the South African economy, and in September last year we actually acquired another 2 shopping centres in KZN, one in Ulundi, the other one in Ladysmith. So we're not shy away from, there is always risk in any investment, but I think our comfort is that the insurance, even our insurance that we have on properties, we see that it does work in terms of getting proceeds from the riots. And as I said, we're going to put in additional measures, employ local security companies, create and foster better relationships with, community leaders in the areas in which we operate. Look, we've always had those relationships, but I think we need to lift our game to improve and better those relationships. I use an example in Mpumalanga. We have a fantastic relationship with the taxi associations, which help actually protect the shopping centres where we operate. So, we will look at the various stakeholders to see how we can collectively work together so that we can all prevent this from happening in future. Because if we all don't work together, we're all going to be negatively impacted, because we all have a vested interest to make it work.
My message to the communities, including the SAPAWA stakeholders, is I think this is a wonderful opportunity where the platform didn't exist to work together to resolve these issues. Maybe one of those outcomes. And I think it's an opportunity where private property owners, including the municipality in that specific area and the local community, should work together to resolve these issues and to protect those assets. At the end of the day, there were no winners out of this unrest.
Where to from here, I think it's quite a very important discussion for all of us as a country, not just for Sasria, but also for the country. South Africa is a democratic country. The right to strike and riots is enshrined into the constitution, and you can't prevent people from rioting. And in some cases, when there's riots, there's damages. But I think what is important for the security cluster is to make sure that when the damages happen, they are mitigated. The losses are not as big as what we experienced in July riots. And then as a society, I think we need to reflect as a society on how do we deal with grievances. Bear in mind what was destroyed in July riots were properties owned by South Africans. What was destroyed in July were jobs by South Africans. So I think as a society, we also need to reflect on how do we deal with complaints, our anger, how do we channel our anger. And I think that's probably a difficult discussion that we need as a country.
I think the important thing is we've got to look forward. We've got a great country, we've got a beautiful nation of people, but we've got to get away from a lot of the sectarian issues that are happening to us. The government's got to come out and get policies in place and actually action the policies. We're spending too much time on politics within government and within various government factions, and not enough time looking about what the government was elected to do and what at provincial and at local authority level people have been elected to do. And that is to make sure that the taxes that people pay get spent properly, delivering a better life to the citizens of South Africa.
South Africa is an investment destination, continues to drive. So if you look at what is it that is being put right by government, by even business itself, we're talking about lucrative policies, and packages, incentives that are available that continue to make South Africa attractive. This research that I'm referring to, the reputation study, actually says the willingness of people to come and plow their money in South Africa is there. So people have appetite for South Africa, purely because we're a very sophisticated market. We house a number of multinational brands, and I can tell you that actually gives us a boost in terms of our profile.
If really there's one thing that for me, if at the end of this documentary, any stakeholders, because it's meant to cover various stakeholders, but the one particular stakeholder that in my view has to take something out of it would be the people that have been part of this destruction, that they just need to reflect after watching this and really understand the gravity of the situation and ask themselves the question, what have we really done? What destruction have we caused, and what could have been if Sasria, for instance, was not there, so that it resonates with them? What have we done?
Assets, infrastructure is there to work for us. Without that infrastructure and the destruction of that infrastructure, we become poorer as a nation. No matter how noble our cause is that generates the need to strike, but destruction of infrastructure makes things a little bit more difficult than before. We've seen the impact of the July riots on South African society. People have lost jobs that they will never be able to regain. Consumers are unable to shop at their nearest shop to go and buy bread. So the cost of bread is no longer the 18 rands you used to pay. Now you have to pay a taxi fare for an extra trip. So the cost of bread has doubled. So these things come with difficulty to all of us, not just Sasria. So my appeal is that let's not destroy infrastructure.